All right, welcome to the new JFK Show number 224. And I know we said it was 225 last week, but I was wrong. So we're going to go ahead and call this one 224. We've got Phil Nelson back for the third week in a row, and we can't get him often enough. We've got Larry and Jim and myself, and we're going to go on and talk more about MLK. Phil Nelson, welcome to the show, and go ahead.
Okay, let me put my little slideshow together here, and we're off. Just a moment.
There it is.
I can get my computer to respond here. Okay, so this evening we're going to be talking about my latest book, which was published last May. Unfortunately, a month late, but thanks to dithering around at the publishers. But I'm just going to try to summarize the book for starters, and then we'll move on from there. I want to just point out that most people haven't followed the Martin Luther King assassination as they have JFK's. Even the same people who are very familiar with the JFK assassination, even from the get-go, were sort of convinced, because they were flim-flammed by the government into presuming that the case was solved. And that's not really the case, as I will be pointing out here. So within the book, I tried to bring coherence to what really happened in the assassination of Dr. King based on the best of the truth-seeking books while summarizing the most important previous books. In the process, new factual evidence is revealed that proves the innocence of James Earl Ray. I've documented within the book that it was not James Earl Ray who stalked Dr. King around the country. It was the FBI. I've done that with a whole lot of help from other authors, including primarily Dr. William Pepper. But for the first time, I examined how the FBI recruited famed novelists to write phony stories, as only novelists could do, to frame James Earl Ray for King's murder, and how that cover-up continues even now, 5 decades later, with numerous continuing specific actions to strengthen it. And I'll touch on that as well. The writers who were given this mission in 1968, I believe even before the assassination, in the case of William Bradford Huey at least, and possibly the other two as well. But there were 3 who wrote books in succession. Well, first of all, Huey wrote 3 articles in Look magazine, and that kicked off the whole meme that he was working at, was to portray James Earl Ray as a vicious Southern racist, a hater and a stalker of Dr. King, and none of that was true. He wasn't even Southern. Now, he wrote a book then in 1970. It was published in 1970, that is. And that was originally titled They Slew the Dreamer. But just before it went to press, he changed it to He Slew the Dreamer, because he was trying to convince people there was no conspiracy whatsoever. No one aided James Earl Ray. So that book was followed in 1972 by a book by Gerald Frank, and then a couple of years later, in 1976, George McMillan, who happens to be the husband of Priscilla Johnson McMillan, both of whom were connected to the CIA. In fact, all 3 of these guys were connected to the CIA. So we're going to examine the works of those authors as well, especially of Huey, though, in considerable detail.
Yeah, didn't they use Priscilla to have a hit job on Lee Oswald? I think I have that book, in fact.
Well, yes, it was called Marina and Lee, I think.
Yeah, Marina and Lee.
But it was really, it was basically supposedly the story of Marina, who, well, she was hoodwinked into getting into that one, as well as the one with Norman Mailer. They both betrayed Marina, and those 2, and to a lesser extent, the LaFontaines a little later, all had the honor and the privilege of being able to interview Marina. But because they screwed it up so royally, she has lost faith in anybody. No one can interview her now. as a result of this.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King were not unrelated. In fact, they were all related, part of a continuum that existed. The threads that connect them have been laid bare by many researchers and authors, just as other authors have written books that should have been categorized as fiction. And those authors, I mentioned the first three already in the 70s. And then in the succeeding decades, others came along and picked up the same memes, the same phony theories that I just referred to, starting with Gerald Posner. And then in 2010, Hampton Sides wrote just an incredibly awful book that not only picked up those same memes, but he enhanced them. He was trying to show what a wonderful writer he was. And that book in particular, among all of them, I mean, it was a bestseller, unfortunately, because he's altogether, the three of them, plus Lamar Waldron, a guy named Peyton McMichael, and a couple of guys we all know, I guess, Larry Hancock and Stu Wexler. They're all in that category. And in fact, this latest book by Hancock and Wexler is taking it way beyond the scope of any other factually based book, and inventing relationships that James Earl Ray supposedly had with all kinds of right-wing Ku Klux Klan and Minutemen and you name it. Now,
guilt by association.
Yes. Now I've read all these books, and I've categorized them in this fashion because they, more than any other of the assassinations that I know of, all the books fall into one of two categories. And those were all the popular, basically novels written by novelists. And on the other hand, we have the nonfiction, the truth-seeking books that started out with Mark Lane and with Dick Gregory back in 1970. Also Harold Weisberg wrote his major book on that called Frame Up. Dr. Philip Melanson and John Avery Emerson, more recently, Ethan Theoharis, and a little-known book by Lyndon Barston and John Larry Ray was written about, I guess, 15 or 20 years ago. And that had important new information in it as well. And of course, Dr. Pepper. Dr. Pepper has now written 3 books. And each of them have evolved a little more from the previous. So his latest book, The Plot to Murder Martin Luther King, was just written in 2016. It was written at the very time when I had decided to pursue my research, and it was very fortunate in terms of timing. Let's talk a little bit about my epiphanies, though. I had several of them when I was researching and writing this book. Most importantly was when I discovered how some of the first popular authors had brazenly twisted James Earl Ray's statements into exact opposite context, and how they fabricated falsely incriminating assertions to prove his guilt. Dozens of examples are referenced in the book. And probably the most profound epiphany I discovered was how the plotters in all 3 of the 1960s major assassinations used the magician's trick called setting first impressions to frame the selected patsies. Of course, for JFK's murder, it was how Lee Harvey Oswald was very mysteriously named in the immediate aftermath, within minutes, practically, and quickly became the subject of an all-points bulletin, the one and only suspect ever on that list. For Robert Kennedy's murder, it was how Sirhan Sirhan was guided into place just in time so that dozens of witnesses would see him firing away, even though he was firing randomly around the room and into the ceiling. Even though his facial expression gave away his drugged and hypnotic state, and a lot of the witnesses had pointed that out. For Martin Luther King's murder, the biggest tool they used was in getting a key photo circulated and how popular authors immediately began writing fake news stories, then books about James Earl Ray to prove his guilt in King's murder. And that was not just coincidental or serendipitous. It was as if they were all put on a mission. Now, we're going to pause here and have Dick Gregory speak about a fellow named Reverend Billy Kyles and the lies that he had made, because he was one of numerous, I haven't even counted all of them, but there were numerous paid informers, either to the FBI, most to the FBI, but he was a paid informer of the Memphis Police Department. And we're going to be touching on several others as we go along here, but let's start with Billy Kyles in this video.
I'll show you a little 3-minute clip of the minister that Dr. King was going by his house for dinner. He was due at 7, but they had to move it up for 7. It'd be a little too dark to see somebody. So they moved it to 6 o'clock. 2 years ago at a press conference in Memphis, I get a call. And they said, so-and-so thinking about killing so-and-so. I said, what? I said, well, he said something at a press conference. I said, put him on the phone. I said, whatever you do, get that film. Because once NBC realized that this brother was slipped and saved, we will never get our hands on the film. What you fixing to see now went into the evidence in the King trial where they brought a wrongful death suit, and I'll explain that to you quickly in a minute. But what you're fixing to witness now is the man who came by to get King to take him to dinner. And 30 years later at a press conference, he slipped, because God do baffle your mind sometimes. You look. No hurry. But that gave me the wonderful privilege of spending the last hour on earth. 3 preachers in a room, Abernathy, King, and Kyle. And we spent that last hour together in room 306 at the Lorraine Motel. The press is always curious, and writers, what went on? What did you talk about? I said, we just talk preacher talk. What preachers talk about when they get together. Y'all pay the attention to what you're fixing to hear now. About 5:45, we walked on the balcony, and he was talking to people in the courtyard. He stood here and I stood there. Only as I moved away, so we could have a clear shot, the shot rang out. Thank you. Turned around and then I stood back on the balcony. Only as I moved away, so we could have a clear shot. Only as I moved away, so we could have a clear shot. Wait, listen. Listen. 30 years later, his brother never realized he would slip and say that. I'll show you a little 3-minute clip.
I was just paying attention. It's room 306. 3 plus 6 is 9. And it happened at 6:15. There's 2 6s right there. 5 plus 1 and the 6. So I'm going to look into that a little more. I don't know if it means anything or not.
I'd like to hear what you find out about that.
I will.
Okay. Well, I mentioned that business about the magician's trick called setting first impressions. And there were a number of incidents that happened here. But before I get into that, let's have just a look at this fellow named Ernest Withers. He was a photographer. He was one of the numerous paid informers. And for some reason, he didn't show up right away in the Martin Luther King assassination. I think that they were saving him from exposure.
And was he African American?
Yes. Anyway, but throughout the 50s and 60s, Withers snapped many key moments in the South. All this verbiage here came from the New Yorker magazine on September 15th, 2010. So just not even a decade ago, we finally learned. It wasn't known until 2010. And the New Yorker magazine was basically parroting another article in the Memphis Commercial Appeal, where it was originally announced that they had just discovered that Withers had been through all that time for 20, for 15 or 20 years at least. He was an insider who had covered it all, from the Emmett Till murder that jump-started the movement in 1955 to the Little Rock school crisis, the integration of Ole Miss, and now the 1968 sanitation strike that brought King to Memphis and his death summarizes the appeal. Okay, the fact that it took 40 years to even find that he was an FBI informant, and the same can be said for most of the other informants, that fact alone speaks volumes about why it's taken so long for things to unravel. The articles basically broke the news that this has been going on, and the FBI had called him a super informant because he was able to get into all the meetings of the SCLC, go wherever he wished, be automatically invited in. And it led to this photo that we see on the screen now. And that iconic photo was a pre-planned event. And it becomes obvious. The more you look into it, the more you think about it, it becomes obvious. Well, first of all, it was known a long time ago that Merrill McCullough was the first man. That Merrill McCullough was a Memphis Police Department informant as well, just like Billy Kyles. And he was assigned to meet Dr. King at the airport and escort him around. He was with him the whole time. So he knew exactly where he was. He was reporting back to a fellow named Frank Holloman, who was the commissioner of police and the fire department. And that was a very unique deal because that gave him control over the fire department right next door to the Lorraine Hotel. They had one of the stations there. So they put someone up there to monitor everything that was going on inside. And Merrill McCullough was with King. He was, in fact, the very first one who reached him right after he was shot. And it became clear to a lot of people decades later that was for the very purpose of checking his pulse and looking and seeing what the damage was and to make sure he was dead or whether he was dead or not. It turned out he did not die right away. And that's a whole nother story that we'll get to later. Now we're going to see another video by a fellow named Steve Coakley, who discusses Jesse Jackson's suspicious actions.
Doctor is the one who was picked to replace Martin King, but Jesse is the one he trained. If you had spent all this time on putting him in place, and you ain't got nobody else around Martin. Now, Andy was supposed to be shot with Martin, but Andy wasn't on the balcony. He was on the floor, so he didn't get it. Ralph was inside, so he didn't get it. Key point, if you spend all that time, and Martin's about to say you are an agent, do you understand that you got to press go on the assassination? Because now Martin is so continuously condemning you, you got wiretaps everywhere. And we know what he said about Jesse in front of everybody, but who knows what he said when it was just him and Ralph? So now there's Ralph, there's Andy. Now, why is Jesse running up this way when everybody else came up that stairway and went that way? Because he had to make sure that room 316 and 317 didn't have no remnant of invader running out of it. Remember, he had that could have been the invaders running down that ramp right there. And when those people start that phony pointing, maybe the invaders might have went, no, down there. You understand? Because the invaders had what? Okay, now, there's the maid, there's the cart. You see that cart? There are the wheels. You understand? At 6 o'clock, you ain't changing no beds and no motel? Check. Okay, let's let it run. There's a good shot of McCullough. There's Martin with the towel over his face. There's Martin again.
I looked up and didn't see him on the balcony, except that I saw his shoes sticking out the end of the balcony. The police, instead of going to where the guy came from, they were all coming to see what happened. So the picture on the balcony was, I was trying to say, it came from over there.
Stop. Stop. There we go. That's good. There's that phony point. There's Jesse's head right there, making sure that he ran up there and gave a pointing. Now, here's the problem with the people pointing. All of the people pointing were this way, looking up to Martin. The shots came from behind them, whether from the bushes or from the rooming house, it was behind them. Not one single person said they turned around and saw somebody, or at the rooming house, those that even saw anybody, Solomon Jones, Earl Caldwell, saw somebody moving in the bushes. Check. So how is it that those with their back turned suddenly become so definitive on something they didn't even see? You understand? It's not logical that they're primary sources for a focus.
Wow.
Yeah, those invaders that he was referring to was a group of black kids, basically. Many of them were still in high school, and some were just out of high school. So they were all males. They were all black males, local people, except that they were infiltrated too. Many people were brought in from Chicago and St. Louis, many others. The more militant and a little older people, guys, were brought in to make sure that, well, in the they had been there a week before, on March the 28th, when, well, but we'll be getting to that. Let's just hold that thought, but you'll hear more about the invaders. They had a very prominent role here, but it's a little bit early. I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So let's go back and talk about the Martin Luther King records that were released in 2017. And it was sort of an irony because, 2017, that's when we were supposed to get all the JFK files. And we still haven't accomplished that yet. But amongst those files, some of them that were released with the JFK files were actually Martin Luther King related assassination files. And for some reason, they were strangely released. It probably is a telltale admission that there were many commonalities in all of them, and that for whatever reason, they were all filed together. It's a wonder we didn't get some of the Robert Kennedy files at the same time. Describing the Martin Luther King records released on November the 2nd, 2017, as indicated in the slide there. A Washington Post headline appeared the next day, which proves Shakespeare's point about how the truth will out eventually. Even the Post might eventually figure things out. But that file was a 20-page dossier dated March the 12th, 1968. That was just a matter of 3 weeks or so before the assassination. And it had numerous unsubstantiated charges from anonymous sources, something usually not taken very seriously. But that was, since it was just 3 weeks before, it begs a profound question. Was this file and the associated meeting a part of the final pieces of the lengthy timeline begun over 4 years earlier, the culmination of a course of events that marked a high-level go, no-go touchstone decision to proceed with the plot? If so, that dossier and the date and associated meeting can be considered as being the point of no return, because 2 weeks after the dossier was circulated, the FBI would sabotage Dr. King's protest march in Memphis. That's what I was referring to a minute ago, March 28th. with violence, and that would force him to return a week later for the completion of the last task. Just 4 years earlier, back on December the 23rd, 1963, only 1 month after JFK's assassination, by the way, it was almost like, okay, we got that project done. Now we're going to turn to these other two projects. And this was, of course, only one of the two. So the early planning began in 1964, just after this meeting, when Hoover and Tolson assigned Deke DeLoach, a sycophant, you can almost see that in his facial expression there, to both Hoover and Johnson, whose primary function was the FBI's liaison with the White House. And he also was a liaison to Congress. But he was like a project manager in charge of putting the selected operatives in place, like Raoul and others who were put in place to assist him, like two convicted felons, a guy named Randy Rosenson and another by the name of Jules Rico Kimball, both of whom were connected to the FBI and CIA, and that's been proven primarily by Dr. King, but others as well. I mean, Dr. Pepper, pardon me. So the first writer recruit was this fellow we mentioned earlier, William Bradford Huey. He was a famed but flawed author, also known as a checkbook journalist, who was assigned the mission to frame Ray. Huey had known Hoover for over 20 years. His articles and book were filled with carefully crafted lies, sprinkled with just enough truth to make the tales believable, at least in the early years before they could be completely debunked. I want to focus on Huey's all-important role in creating this meeting, because I believe he was given this mission even well before King was assassinated. Before we get to that, let's take a closer look at Huey's background. Hoover had known Huey for over 20 years and had for a time been his and the FBI's mouthpiece after he took over the American Mercury magazine. It was formerly a literary jewel in the 1930s and 1940s when it was run by H.L. Mencken. During that period, it had published essays by such literary giants as F. Scott Fitzgerald, Carl Sandburg, Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner, and Eugene O'Neill, among others. But then it was taken over by Huey in 1950, and he ran it into the ground. By 1955, it was nearly bankrupt and was sold to the highest bidder, who turned it into a racist rag before mercifully shutting it down. In that period of 5 years when he was running it, some of the articles came directly from the FBI. Hoover himself, supposedly, although it was probably one of his ghostwriters who did it for him. In 1956, Huey became a correspondent for Look magazine, and his first major story, as I've explained in detail within the book, was about the 1955 murder of Emmett Till. As a renowned checkbook journalist, he had paid the accused men, who had been left off the hook by an all-white, all-male jury. They were both paid $4,000 each to assert that they had actually murdered Till, although that story has now been retracted by the victim herself. The whole thing was made up and put out and exacerbated by Huey himself. And so even now, 60 years later, whatever, that woman came out and said, no, that they weren't murderers at all. It was some other guy who's already dead. So anyway, there's a whole lot more to that story, and it goes into Huey's nefarious methods and loathsome ethics. But the point is, it was his first skill set that made him the perfect candidate to write the first in-depth magazine articles and books to frame James Earl Ray. As I say, that's an incredible story in itself, and it takes up about 4 pages, I think, in the book. So, but he was the one I said before, who framed the meme that James Earl Ray was a vicious Southern racist and hater, stalker, and murderer of Martin Luther King Jr., and that he was none of the above. So the Patsy gets along well with others, and even in prison, he sort of kept to himself, and he wasn't known even by a lot of his fellow prisoners. But somehow he did like to try to escape, and multiple times he tried. Finally, in 1967, he was able to, but guess what? He was assisted by the warden himself, who had been paid off, bribed by Hoover and Tolson. Tolson was from that area in Missouri, and he knew a lot of people, by the way. And he went back to Missouri and paid that warden $25,000 to facilitate Ray's escape in April of 1967. So anyway, he escaped, went to Chicago, worked in a restaurant with 75 employees, and was well liked by all of them. Half of them were Black. The owners loved him. They were sorry to lose him, begged him to stay. Can you believe that? But if you read Huey's book, you would never believe that, or the other authors I just mentioned. But he decided he had to move on, though. He was afraid of getting caught. He wanted to get to Canada, so he would be out of the reach, at least, of U.S. Police. So he vowed, when he did go there, he vowed to himself never to return to the U.S. as an escaped convict. But he got to Montreal. He connected there with CIA operatives, the two guys I mentioned before, that Rosenson and Rico. Both of them were up there at that same period of time. And it's pretty clear that in Chicago, he was contacted by somebody to get to Montreal because they wanted to retrain him. This goes back to his days in the service, back in the late 40s into 1950, when he was in Germany. And he was subjected to all kinds of MK Ultra experiments. And that's where his problems began in the Army. While he met the FBI CIA operative named Raoul. He spelled his name with an O in the middle of it, which is not the correct spelling, but I guess he thought it sounded as if it had an O in the middle. Anyway, he also met an intelligent and what he called a beautiful woman, quickly becomes intimate with her, talking about it within 3 days, 2 or 3 days or something. And this lady, it turned out that Huey was very surprised, actually chagrined about that, because it was the antithesis of his twisted story about James's awkward social skills, especially with women. So Huey lied in his magazine articles, claiming that Ray had told her hateful and racist things to begin the theme in his articles and book. But eventually, it was discovered, and this is the one thing that the House Select Committee did that was worthy of all the funds that they expended. And that is, the House Select Committee proved that after having interviewed that woman and also a Mexican woman that he wound up dating and when he wound up going to Mexico later, that Huey had done the same thing. In both cases, he did not mention their names because he was, he could hide under the cover. He was trying to protect them because, after all, they were associated with this escaped killer. But in both cases, both of them denied the stories that had been told by Huey, i.e., they were made up. So Huey presumed that he could lie about them in his articles, given that he didn't name them anyway, so they theoretically could be talking about someone else. But as I say, the House Select Committee didn't do much of anything other than, as we're going to see in just a little while, copy everything that was in Huey's book. But on this one, a very important point is that they essentially proved that he was not a racist. Yet they didn't unwind all the other things that were built around that central point. For instance, that he hated Martin Luther King because he was a racist. And he stalked him because he was a racist and a hater. But if you show that he was never a racist, then how could you continue using those memes? But they did. They tried to just cover it up and not make a big deal about that. And as a result, practically no one even knew it. And the only reason I knew it is because I read the House Select Committee, all the files, all their reports and so forth, and thought, well, this doesn't make sense at all. So anyway, let's go on to the fourth quarter and the first quarter into the first quarter of 1968. Basically, Raoul got Ray involved in petty smuggling runs across the Canadian border first, things like stolen cigarettes, booze, drugs, and jewelry. And then in order to get him to take the hook, he basically told Ray that he had other jobs waiting for him, but he had to go back to the U.S. in order to do it because that's where the big money is. So he convinced him to go back to the U.S. because he was going to furnish him a passport and whatever other papers he might need. He's going to buy him a new car, money. By the way, he had driven from Chicago to Montreal in a $200 junker that he picked up in some used car lot. Ironically, about 3 or 4 days later, when he acquired that, or 3 or 4 days before that, he supposedly, according to the FBI would not give up this story, that he robbed a bank in Alton, Illinois, and got away with $27,000. Well, if that were true, why would he buy an old junker? Why want to buy, a new Corvette or something? Well, they didn't have to explain this, but that was the situation they were creating. So we're going to now go into the last 3 weeks of Martin Luther King's life. And I'm just skipping over a lot of the details about how Ray had gone from Canada to Birmingham, bought that Mustang, and then was asked to go to Texas, to Dallas, through New Orleans, another stopping point, and then Dallas, and then down to the border towns of Mexico. I think it was Nuevo Laredo, primarily. So he was doing some smuggling there as well. And then after he had done enough of that to satisfy, I guess, Raoul and his handler or his bosses back in the FBI headquarters, that he's firmly on the hook. We can let him go and spend a little time down in Puerto Vallarta and Acapulco, I guess, too. And so for weeks or a few months, he was kind of just wandering around like a redneck playboy, driving his new Mustang. And so he went there. That's when he had the affair with the Mexican woman. And then in November of 1967, Raoul told him to go back to Los Angeles now and find a room there, and which is what he did. He was there for 4 months. Okay, now after a month, so he went there in November. In December, he actually took a trip back to New Orleans, and a round trip, and it was suspected that it was there that he also re-met with those guys from the CIA that I mentioned earlier, and was given more money because it was running out at that point, and so Raoul gave him a new infusion of money, and he then went back to LA, and he stayed there until middle of March, when he got a call from Raoul. He had a note or something. Anyway, they talked, and Raoul wanted him to go back to New Orleans, pack up everything, get rid of all his stuff. And so he was busy doing that on March the 16th when Martin Luther King flew into Los Angeles. Okay, and of course, this whole time, Ray was oblivious to where Martin Luther King was. He really wasn't concerned about that. He was oblivious to it. So here with King in town, on the 17th, Ray decides to drive 2,000 miles in 4.5 days back to New Orleans. So that was basically 500 miles a day more or less, alone this time. That other trip, he had a hippie friend who was also suspected of being an FBI informant. That was never proven one way or the other, but it seems obvious that he was. So in this case, in the middle of Martin Luther King's visit to Los Angeles, he was there for 3 days. On the second day, the day in the middle, Ray picks up and moves. He's headed to New Orleans. Well, what do you think? How do you think William Bradford Huey handled that one? That was when he decided to start stalking Martin Luther King. But unfortunately, he didn't start right there. He was right in the same town. But according to Huey, he wasn't really going to New Orleans anyway. He was going to Selma, Alabama. That's where he was going. Now, we're going to get to that now. Because after driving 2,000 miles, he gets it to New Orleans, and then was told that, well, Raoul had a change of plans. He went to Birmingham. You got to go to Birmingham, meet him on the 23rd at noon on the 23rd. So on the 22nd, the next day after sleeping that night, he gets in his car, and it's very important to understand that there was a huge storm going on in that whole area, Tennessee and down to Louisiana and so forth. And after driving 300 miles in this storm, it's getting dark. He randomly arrives in Selma and decided he's going to stay the night there at the famous Flamingo Motel. It doesn't look quite like the flamingos in Los Angeles or Las Vegas or Miami. It's a little run down.
Yeah, it looks like a place where they rent by the hour.
Yeah. It's no longer there now, but that was a picture of what it used to look like. As we'll see shortly, though, Dr. King was nowhere near Selma. Huey, that was another invention, an outright absolute lie that, well, I was the first one who has discovered this because I remember that March 22nd date from somewhere else. We'll be getting to that. According to Huey and a succession of other authors, all the way down to the present, those authors I mentioned, Posner and Hampton Sides, Larry Hancock, and Stu Wexler, they all latched onto that, and they're repeating the same thing. He was never there. So on March 21st, after arriving in New Orleans and learning that he had to go into Selma, Huey picks up the story there and says that there was a article in the New Orleans Times-Picayune that stated that Martin Luther King was going to be near Selma on the 22nd, and that is when Huey created this lie. But I looked up that article. See, the reason that no one spotted that is because by the time his book came out in 1970, it was 2 years old. And no one thought to go back and double check that and do a fact checking thing, not even the FBI or the Memphis police or no one apparently did. And none of these authors did. I mean, none of the even truth seeking authors. It's not in any of Pepper's books. It's not it's in none of the other books. But when I saw something, let me just finish this. The fact it was picked up in a succession of books, and it still is the standing theory, or the standing meme that's what happened, and nothing like that happened at all. This is the reason here, because I had seen that there was a huge freak blizzard, which rarely happens even in the wintertime. But here it was first day of spring, second day of spring. And they had a 17-inch snowstorm. All flights were canceled. And Huey still turned that Selma stopover into his primary original destination, all to advance the stalking canard. And that was no inadvertent error. He went way out of his way to do this. How could he invent this? Dr. King was never even scheduled to be in Memphis that day. There was nothing in that New Orleans newspaper like that. That article was only about Dr. King's plans for the Poor People's Campaign back in Washington. So the sanitation workers' strike was rescheduled. King was at his home that evening of March 21st, and he woke up because one of the Memphis reverends who were not paid informant, who was not a paid informant, Lowry was his name, called him and told him, Martin, you have to reschedule because we got the 17 inches of snow and there, there's no flights coming in or out, and everything is closed up around here. So he stayed in Atlanta that entire day. He had never even planned to be anywhere near Selma. But that story stood, and it still stands. That you can pick it up and look at it for yourself. It's in all these books. He was supposed to be in Selma. Okay, so the takes us. So for 50 years that lie stood, and it's still standing because my book is not selling as well as it should have been. Anyway, this is what I was referring to earlier. This is a copy of the House Select Committee report from that 2017 release that I mentioned earlier. Okay, and if it hadn't been for that, I would not have even known this, possibly, I don't know. But on page 78, part 1 of 2, citing Huey, it states that James Earl Ray went from LA to New Orleans to Selma to stalk Martin Luther King on March 22nd. From New Orleans, they typed, Ray drove to Selma. And you notice they didn't even mention New Orleans, where Ray began to stalk Dr. King according to Huey's statement. Huey is cited hundreds of times. This is just one paragraph followed by another. And you see his name right there. They cited Huey as the source, as the expert, even though on another page they had to acknowledge that King was scheduled to be in Memphis that day, though he had to change plans because of the blizzard. So they acknowledged that. On one page they have March 22nd, he was in Selma. The other page they said he had to cancel his trip to Memphis. And no one noticed. Okay, so as a result of that, on the following day, he took an airplane, and this I got from Taylor Branch. Taylor Branch wrote the all-time biography of Martin Luther King. It's a 3-volume set, and on that third of those books, he got into his entire schedule. So you can see anybody could have picked up that book and figured out that he was never even planning to go there. Anyway, King rescheduled his trip to Memphis 6 days later, March 28th. But it was sabotaged by the FBI. They set it up so that they knew that his whole shtick about nonviolent protests would fall apart there, because they were going to ensure that it would fall apart, and that's what they did. They had these guys come in and started crashing windows, breaking windows. And as soon as all that started, King canceled his plan and said, we have to cancel this whole thing. Get me out of here. And so they actually absconded with some lady's car that was driving by and asked her to please let them borrow her car. They did, and they went to the motel. And it was a motel called the Holiday Inn, called the Rivermont Holiday Inn. And it was kind of a very nice, that's where he stayed. One of 2 Hollywood Holiday Inns is where he always stayed. Even though all of these other authors, every single one of them say that he always stayed at the Lorraine. The fact that Dr. Pepper figured out from a lot of investigation was that he had never stayed there. He had gone to meetings there. He had met people for lunch there, for lunch and meetings and so forth. And that's exactly what he had planned to do on the 28th. But what happened is, as a result of all of this, and so they had all these newspaper articles all written and prepared So they sent them by teletype out so that they would be sure to hit all the newspapers around the country the next day, lying about all of this and about how he led that march and he lost control of it and so forth and so forth. And they even said that he led the march from the safety of his car. But this photo here shows him right there. That's him leading that march for about a block or two, maybe at the most, before it was canceled. So the next day, March 29th, these papers, and these were just, they were obviously in all the major papers, but I posted all of these because these are even the little papers from around the country. And they're all, you can see my red circles around all these headlines. And they all are talking about how horrible it was that he lost control of his own protest march. And that was embellished from the start. They just more lies. Basically, they were trying to shame him. They did all this to shame him. When he would have to go back to make things right and square things up and so forth. They forced him to come back in another week. He didn't want to come back. He had no plans to go back in April because he thought after this, he had to get back and work on his Poor People's Campaign in D.C. That was going to be in late April. So as a result of all this, the FBI scribes had written articles weeks in advance, news articles and suggested talking points for hyping hateful editorials, and sent them to the newspapers, overnight. They even furnished a suggested headline for the editorial page: "Do as I say, not as I do." As expected, the memorandum provoked the desired result the following day. Front page articles and editorial page hyperbole appeared in newspapers around the country. The New York Times, for example, dutifully printed an editorial titled "Mini Riot in Memphis" that picked up on all the points the FBI scribes had listed. Together, those points painted a new theme for Dr. King, obliterating the old one of nonviolent protests. Now, less than a week before his murder, the meme became fomenter of unbridled chaos and violence. And as I say, the purpose was to shame him into staying the next time at the Lorraine, because they had already figured out that had all the perfect place for a killing zone, because there were taller buildings all around it.
Yeah, Phil, didn't they tell him that it was a shame that he was staying in a nice white hotel and it'd be better if he went to the Lorraine, which was managed by black people?
Yes, that is absolutely what all those, that was the point that all those articles were making.
Yeah, and one more thing real quick. I saw next to the mini riot or the riot in Memphis, they had Israeli jet fighters bomb Jordan. So the propaganda was going hardcore back then, that day.
Now, Phil, we have less than 10 minutes, so you want to find the right point to carry over for next week when we'll bring you back.
Okay, all right. Let's talk about that. Let me just finish with March. My slides on March, and starting with April, we'll come back to that. Okay.
Yeah.
So the next day, these are just some of the things that came out the next day, and one of them was the Senator Byrd there, the guy in the KKK outfit. He rose to the rank of Kleagle and Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and he was so clueless that he even used the N-word in a TV interview in 2001. He gave a pre-planned, FBI-written 2,600-word speech condemning King on the floor of the Senate at 9 o'clock in the morning the next day. And this, if you read the entire piece, then you would understand he didn't whip that out overnight in his ballpoint pen, at his desk. That was something that took a lot of, work just to put it together. But this is just one paragraph in it. In the next piece, yesterday, the nation was given a preview of what may be in store for this city by the outrageous and despicable riot that Martin Luther King helped to bring about in Memphis. If this self-seeking rabble-rouser is allowed to go through with his plans here, Washington may well be treated to the same kind of violence, destruction, looting, and bloodshed.
Disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful.
It's beyond disgraceful.
Yeah, provocateurs are always brought out. When we had lost our monuments last year, it was all provocateurs brought in from out of state.
Yep, I can believe
All
that.
the trick in the book.
But I've shown in the book some more details about this, and the fact that that speech had been planned by who other than Arthur Deloach, Deke Deloach, and probably all these plans really, emanated from, the Hoover.
Edgar wanted to frame him as a bad guy, so when he was killed, they could claim there were good reasons for it, and we ought not to be unhappy about it.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Mark Lane did a lot of work on this too, and he's the one who figured that point out. I shouldn't take full credit for that. I'm not. I have pointed out where I have found out things that no one else had figured out. But the whole point of my book was to bring it all together and make it a coherent story. Because frankly, the other books were not, I don't believe they were well written in context of people sitting there and just one book reading and getting a whole understanding of all of it. They're all, as you might have, Harold Weisberg was a hell of an investigator, but he wasn't much of a writer. Now, as Mark Lane pointed out, there were earmarks of the FBI's tutelage within Byrd's speech, including the reference to King as the Messiah, who would be, quote, conducting a lay-in at a posh Washington hotel, all of which resembled other FBI memos eventually uncovered by the Church Committee in 1975. And by the way, that entire speech is printed in Appendix C in my book. And it's something that I think you would, if you tried to find out on the internet, well, good luck. I was not able to find it.
Well, it's a stark piece of propaganda foisted off on the American people by a malevolent FBI headed by a director who wanted to bring about the death of this great American.
That's exactly right. Now, this might be the last slide that we're going to
Tonight.
Well, no, there's one more if we have enough time. Yeah, okay. So March 29, 30th to the 31st, that is. As directed by Raoul, James bought a new rifle on March the 29th. And then he took it back to Raoul, and Raoul says, no, that'll never do. We need a bigger bore rifle than that. And it was a Remington 243 caliber. And he said, we need a bigger bore than that. That would have been fine for this, job, so to speak. But so he went back to the same shop and explained to the guy at the counter that it turns out his brother says, we're going to go deer hunting in Wisconsin. The deer up there are much bigger than they are here in Alabama. And so we need a bigger rifle. That's about what he knew about. I mean, he didn't, as you see in the next bullet, the salesman said, and he said this plaintively, repeatedly, trying to get across the point, not only to the FBI, not only to the police who interviewed him, but even to the House Select Committee investigators 10 years later. And they still didn't do anything about this little anomaly here. The salesman says he knew nothing about guns. I mean, nothing. He may have known something about pistols, but he didn't know anything about long rifles. But anyway, as instructed by Raoul, he had advised James Orway that he needed to be in Memphis on April the 3rd. And so why would he want to drive all the way back to Atlanta from Birmingham? That's where they were. Why would he go back there and then back? Well, Huey decided that was important for whatever reason. And they actually faked a laundry ticket to say that he actually picked up his laundry. He drove all the way from Birmingham back to Atlanta for the purpose of picking up his laundry. You know, and we're talking about his underwear and a couple of shirts or whatever, but I mean, that's just silly. He had left some of his laundry, but he had his other, I mean, he had enough clothes that he didn't need to go back again. But they wanted to make sure that he went back so he could try to portray him as stalking King back in Atlanta. And you get this, Martin Luther King was in Washington, D.C. that whole time. And on the day that King comes back, then Huey says he left Atlanta and drove to Memphis. Started driving to Memphis.
The whole stalking narrative has no foundation whatsoever. Obviously, complete fabrication. The evidence all shows he wasn't stalking MLK.
That's exactly what it is. Okay, so this will be the last slide that we're going to do. And that last week, throughout these travels, as I say here, Ray is never even in the same town as Martin Luther King until April the 4th. For 3 hours, they were in Memphis at the same time. And that's only because he was ordered to go there. Whoops. Oh, back. Ray went from Selma to Birmingham and then picked up Raul, and they went to Atlanta together. And then Ray notes key places like the bus station and the routes and the stops and the restaurants and so forth on a map, as he had done in every new city he ever went to. That was just a habit of his because it helped him, you know, navigate around the new city. And he left that, I guess inadvertently, I'm not sure if it was or whatever, but he had left that in that apartment that they had rented together, Raul and he. And when the investigators found it, they allowed Huey to see it, and he said, well, this has got to be how he was mapping his stalking, and he turned that into another tool to put in his book to say that it was for that purpose, even though—
You're doing a great job of elaborating the methodology of the FBI in framing somebody for a crime they did not commit.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was all about. But in summation here, all of this was complete BS, all made up lies. Huey, I'm talking about Huey here, he constructed the entire stalker meme for Ray out of whole cloth. He lied about the date Ray left LA. He said March 18th, the same day that King left, but no, it was the 17th. And it would have been almost impossible for him to drive that far. You know, he would have to cover about 800 miles a day or something. Because that was when he was supposedly began stalking Martin Luther King, and he tried to do that, but actually that's another thing the House Select Committee also decided it was the 17th.
Just take it off share. Take it off share, Phil.
I'm sorry?
Just end share.
Yeah, just hit the little green button in the middle.
Oh, end share. Okay. Well, stop share actually.
Yeah.
So anyway, he lied about all that. He lied about Ray intending to go directly to Selma. He lied about Dr. King's plan to go to Selma. The biggest lie of all. That's the one when the snowstorm hit at Memphis. He lied about Ray not going to Birmingham to meet Raul. He lied about Ray's marking up the map of Atlanta. He lied about Ray stalking King in Atlanta when King wasn't even there.
So who was Huey really working for?
Huey was working for the FBI. He was set up.
Right.
Yeah.
I meant that.
And he was
It's a rather obvious observation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, he was set up so that he would contact this lawyer. His name was
Phil.
Haynes, Arthur Haynes, down in Birmingham, who he knew was the mayor of that city when they had all the riots and so forth that had gone on there. And he exposed himself as being a racist there. And so he was, that's when they started trying to pin Ray into being a racist when this racist lawyer, he hired a racist lawyer to represent him. Well, he got shoehorned into that too. But anyway, all of these.
We're gonna pick up right where you left off next week. Great introduction.
Yeah. Okay,
Lay
Phil.
out the scenario.
Yeah, Phil, this is just incredible presentation. Tell us, where can we get your book?
Well, you can find it on Amazon, of course, but also since they have almost monopoly power these days. But other bookstores, Books A Million and Barnes and Noble area. It's something if people want to have a signed copy, they're welcome to contact me. They can go to my new blog and webpage. It's called LBJ, The Master of Deceit. Okay.
Right there.
Awesome.
Awesome.
We'll come back to this next week when we have a return engagement. We're enjoying this immensely.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to know when to be quiet and pay attention, and tonight was one of those nights. All right, this has been JFK Show number 224. We'll see you next week.
Okay, thank you.
Great job, Phil. Awesome, man.